Are you too busy to be responsive? Choosing when and how to respond is a key element. We'll talk about keeping commitments next on 10 Tenets of Leadership. Hi, welcome to this episode of 10 Tenets of Leadership. I'm Andy McCaskey from SGR News, and in this episode we are going to be talking about keeping commitments and how that's part of leadership and a part of management. And of course, our host, as always, Larry Pendergrass.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, great to be here. I'd also like to welcome two guests. Let's start with Doug Elder. Doug is the CEO at Automation Engineering. And Doug, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about your background.
Yep. Thanks, Larry. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to participate in the 10 Tenets of Leadership. I've got 20 plus years of executive experience in the semiconductor industry and in various roles and markets and regions and responsibilities. And as you mentioned just a minute ago, I've recently taken over as the CEO of a small capital equipment company, currently in the process of delivering systems to the automotive and the mobile camera module market.
Great. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
I'd also like to introduce Terry Barnhart. Terry is the head of process and cultural excellence at Sando, a division of Novartis. Terry, would you tell us a few other words about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Larry. My background is a little bit bounced around from a couple of different things. I started as a scientist and worked at General Electric, working on plastics. I enjoyed the business side of that so much that I spent a couple of years as a consultant for McKinsey & Company. So I did a lot of business consulting with Fortune 100 companies and a lot of international companies as well. And then I worked at Pfizer. And at Pfizer, I started doing some work on improving, not just improving as we think about process and culture and so on, but also improving how we do innovation. And that sort of landed me both a book, which I have out on creating a lean R&D system, but also landed me in the role that I'm in now, which in Sando is improving both culture and process simultaneously in order to build the company.
Great. Thank you, Terry, and welcome. So today we're going to talk about the necessity of keeping your commitments as a leader and how that shapes your organization and allows you to partner with your own people. Specifically, in brief, this tenet says that it's just as important for a leader to keep their commitments as it is for you to expect commitments to be kept from other people. Commitments are sacred. Commitments need to be kept by everybody. And if you look only at keeping your commitments to your supporters and not necessarily to those that work for you or your peers, then it can cause some issues when it comes to your ability to perform at a high level in your business. That's what this tenet is, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'd like to ask each of our guests about their experiences, so perhaps I can start with you, Doug. Could you help us understand what your experience is with this tenet, either pro or con, and if you have an example for us, that'd be wonderful as well.
Well, thanks, Larry. I've been kind of all over the map on this one, where I've been on the side of having people, make commitments but not keep them to me, and experiencing the feeling that I have when that happens, and you kind of think about yourself and how motivated you are, or how you're going to react or participate in a dialogue with that person going forward, or shaping an organization where I would stand up and work with engineering teams in the semiconductor industry, and I would ask maybe an engineering manager, application manager, or some way to stand up and make a commitment that they're going to deliver against either the requirement, the schedule, the costs, whatever it is that they were, talking about, and yeah, deliver that. Just like a sales manager, you go to ask them to commit to deliver that forecast or whatever it is. And a little bit of a quid pro quo, that if you're going to ask them to commit, then you have to be prepared to give a commitment back to them in some form. It may not be in the same context, but they need to, if you're going to ask them to do something, they're going to look for the same return. And you have to be thoughtful about what kind of commitments you're going to make, because they're going to hold you to that. They're going to watch to see whether you're holding to your commitments because you're asking them, they're, as a part of the organization, as a leader, keep their commitments. Again, whether it's in a product development side of things, on the business side of things, whether it's, related to any part of the, infrastructure or the functioning of the organization. So I think this is a crucial element in both on the how you function as an organization, but also how you function with your maybe end customers. I had I lived in Asia for many years, and there's business and there's personal in the Asian markets, and they sometimes will do things and ask you to commit to things just to see if you will, make the commitment, and then whether you'll fulfill that commitment. That's somewhat of a test before they really want to see if they want to partner with you or do business with you. So I've really had an opportunity to be on both sides of this, both in developing organizations and working with different cultures, and I think it's a crucial part of the interpersonal interactions, both in business as well as within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these commitments you've talked about here, Doug, some of them can be very big and some of them can be very small. Right. And this, even the smaller ones tend to be a bit of a test of whether or not this relationship is solid. For instance, you mentioned in Asia. Yeah.
And sometimes you may want to hold some of those things back, quite frankly, because you know that people are watching, they're testing you. And, I had that when I entered this business. It's a small business that had been running, and, people were testing you. You want to hold some of those things back, knowing that they want to see if you're going to fulfill your commitments or honor your word, or, it's also a big part of your character and who you are. So,
right. Makes sense. Yeah. So Terry, maybe we can turn to you and ask for your opinion and your experiences in the same area. Big commitments, small commitments, whether people are watching and what they determine from that, culturally, variations. What have you seen?
Well, it's a very broad topic. So I'm going to actually start with the very smallest of commitments, and that is just showing up to meetings on time. It's an amazing thing when a leader shows up to a meeting with subordinates on time, every time, and makes small commitments like that. The difference between that and someone who ignores them, reschedules at the last second, et cetera, is the people who tend to make those commitments, or at least honor the commitment of the meeting, honor the commitment of the time itself. Those people build culture much more quickly. People follow those people with much greater enthusiasm, in my observation, than people who do not. And this leads, I think, also to people at those sorts of levels really thinking about the commitments that they have to other people for on-time behavior and so on. These small things start adding towards, I think, the things that Doug was talking about. Now, when you get into a meeting, when you say, I'm going to commit to this sales number, I'm going to commit to delivering this innovation, I'm going to commit to this activity, which might be very, very large, involving many, many divisions at once, you can count more on that as a cultural element if the leadership builds from the smaller commitments on up. So I think it's integrated. It's not just making the big commitments. It's not just sticking to those. It's making sure that the small ones go as well. It's making sure that the things you commit to, as Doug says, if you can't commit to something, don't. Be clear about that. But if you can, make sure you hit it, and that's going to be a big cultural building element.
So, recently I read some lessons that leaders had learned just in a paragraph. What have they learned through their careers? And I can't remember, I believe it might have been the CEO of Yahoo said one of the things that they commit to is returning voicemails and emails within 24 hours. Now that's a real commitment to other people. But how do leaders that are very, very busy show this kind of commitment to other people and responsiveness? How is it possible? I mean, everybody's overworked. Can you really be that dependable to everyone? So, Doug, what do you think?
I actually think it goes back to sort of the principles by which you operate. There's integrity. There's what's your character, and I think that maybe the people who are too busy are too self-important. So you have to be looking in the mirror and say, why am I so busy? And what's really important? It goes back to what Terry's saying, and it's respect. It's showing respect for the people in your organization, the people who are emailing you or whatever. I just hired a new director of sales, and I said, look, here's how I operate. I want you to respond to our customers no matter what within 12 hours. That's my commitment. And even if I don't have the answer, I will get the answer for you, and then you respond within 24. And again, it's, you can take that time. It doesn't take a lot, but I think it's really important for you to just establish some, basic, principles under how you're going to operate. And I think that people can come back and rely on in whether you're going to show up to a meeting on time, whether you're going to overcommit, whether you're going to respond within a certain period of time. I think that you have to look at what are your priorities? I think if you're building an organization, you're building a market, you're building a team, whatever it is, how small or how big it is, there's some basic principles under which you want to operate that people can rely on, and that builds trust, that builds loyalty, that builds, all the things that you're looking for in a highly efficient, highly functioning organization. And it's absolutely possible. I think that if you think you're too busy, then you really have to sit back and say, again, what are my priorities? What are my principles under which I'm operating? And in that case, it might be that it's more important that they manage up or manage the street or something else, as opposed to building that culture, kind of what Terry was referring to earlier, that they can rely on, moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Terry, I wonder then, can we have that kind of responsiveness to everybody? I mean, 360 degrees. Should we put a greater priority on being responsive to customers? Greater priority on being responsive to our supervisors, our sponsors? And what does that say about what time is left over for being responsive and keeping our responsiveness and keeping our commitments aren't synonymous, but they are tightly linked. What does that say to people that work for us and our peers?
Well, I think, Larry, that you need to start from the point of trust and what that gains you. So I think Doug made a very important and interesting point about how you can choose what you want to be responsive about first, but also you have to really think about it. If you're really overcommitted in terms of the emails you get, the telephone conversations you have, and so on, you have to ask yourself, have I actually created the trust in the organization so that the people who really should be making those decisions, who really should be doing that work, are actually doing that work and don't need my input? If you actually create that trust, which again starts from making commitments and delivering on those, if you can actually build that trust, then suddenly the amount of things that you need to input on, as opposed to say, what are your thoughts, please handle it, what have you, the ability for you then to push back with a 2-second response, as opposed to several paragraphs or a slide deck or something like this, that ability really does open up your bandwidth. So I think in the end, the answer is you can't always be responsive to everybody every time. That really wasn't kind of the idea. The idea is to create an environment in which both you and your team can flourish, and part of that is building trust, and part of that is building trust is making sure that things you commit to, really you do deliver on.
So let me take an example from what you talked about earlier, Terry. How does that leader who wants to build this feeling of commitments being sacred, and I will keep my commitments and I expect you to do the same, how does that kind of leader respond to a situation where their schedule's being juggled back and forth and they've got to cancel this meeting and they didn't leave enough time between 2 meetings and they're 10 minutes late for that meeting? What do you do when that starts to happen? What does a leader do?
Well, I'm going to have to go back to what Doug said. I think you really need to sit back at that point and ask yourself why you're being pulled in these directions. If you're being pulled in these directions because your customers want you to be, or your customers are pulling you, then how do you spread that load amongst the rest of your team such that it's not just you, or it's not just one person in that team that's always having their schedules moved and so on. But in the end, there are aspects of things that move your schedule. Those are perhaps unavoidable. Question is it a habit? Is it something you've not committed to? Is it something you're really ignoring that you really could do something to improve both your life and the company's life? So I want to come back to what Doug said. Some real reflection on what's causing it can probably lead you to a solution. And sitting here a priori, it's pretty hard to tell what any particular leader's schedule is being whipped back and forth by. Maybe it's his board. Maybe it's his immediate supervisor or president. Maybe it's the people he's working for that he doesn't trust enough or hasn't built enough capability in, so he has to respond to them rather more in depth than he would like to, as a rule.
Makes sense. So, virtually every good idea taken to an extreme becomes a bad idea. At least that's the way I think about it. So let's talk about how this could be taken to the point where it's no longer working. So Doug, if we were to talk about, and in fact, some people talk about a servant-style leadership. Are you familiar with the concept of a servant-style leadership in general? So Doug, I'm kind of curious, if you were to take this to an extreme, what kind of dangers do you run into, and how do you recognize those dangers?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to maybe one of the things Terry referred to or was talking about. But you say servant style, maybe it's autocratic or whatever it might be, another way to define it. But you can force people, you can drive people to overcommit, right? And so that's the thing that you have to be careful of, is that I think that if you can show your organization that you're not going to allow people to overcommit, right? Then I think you have, again, you're building this organization that's going to be, highly efficient and have trust and be effective. But the risk is that you push people to commit, and they will commit no matter, even though they know they have no chance of meeting that schedule, they have no chance of doing whatever it is that you're asking them to commit to. They're just going to commit so that they don't have to deal with your wrath, or they're looking for some, payout, bonus or whatever it might be. That's the incentive to commit to whatever you're asking to commit to. And so the risk is that you get this organization that is just dysfunctional because people are committing to things that they know they have no chance of meeting, right? And I think the other thing that's risky is if you have a leader who is asking people to commit but is not willing to commit themselves, right? I can't remember the term you used, the CEO malaise, or I call it the Teflon manager, that nothing sticks, right? And so they don't commit to anything because they don't want to be held accountable, but yet they're asking you to commit. And so the risk that you have is that you create this environment, this culture where, it's, again, you can't get anything done because people are overcommitting. You have no idea whether, what you're operating off of, whether it's your, P&L, or whether it's your margins, or whether it's an engineering schedule, is real because people commit to get out of the room. And
yeah, interesting. I think the concept or the title, the phrase that you use, the Teflon leader, is really quite descriptive, since nothing really sticks on Teflon. So there are some people certainly that have a leadership style that tends to be directive, and yet when it comes down to it, if there's a problem, nothing really sticks on them. The other people were the ones that committed. So that's a really destructive leadership style, I think, isn't it?
It's really bad. I've worked for several people like that, and the organization basically goes into this flat line where, no one's willing to stick their head up. No one's willing to, so you have an organization that's not willing to take risks. It's not willing to push themselves, the organization, the customer, whatever it might be, technology, and everyone's just kind of, they're first, just doing time. And because they know that person is not willing to hang out and commit, and therefore they're not going to. So you get this really sort of, not very responsive culture or, organization.
Now, there's a related phenomena here that I'd like to talk with Terry about here. You mentioned it briefly, Doug. You call it CEO malaise. It's one other term that's used as a CEO disease. It's a little different than the Teflon manager, in the sense that, I'll describe it briefly. Maybe you can talk about your experiences in this area, Terry. The CEO disease was written about, I think, in 1991 in Business Week. You can go back and take a look at that article. It's a great one. It really talks about what happens when leaders grow in an organization. Fewer and fewer people actually give them the kind of feedback that we all need as human beings in order to have continuous improvement and checking of our behavior. As people start to give you less and less accurate feedback, what the people that rise to the top, if they're not very, very careful, can wind up with a great deal of self-importance, and eventually maybe into some narcissism and other issues. So I'm curious, Terry, have you encountered things like this in your career, and what do you see as the fix for things like this?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and most people, I think, experience both sides of this. Someone who has been, if you will, not affected at all by their rise, and maybe even becoming more humble as they go forward, and then people who are the opposite. Frankly, the people in the CEO suite are very rarely wallflowers. These are people who have worked very hard. They're very ambitious. They're very thoughtful. They're very smart people as a whole. But because of that, and because of their meteoric rise, and because of the threat that their position can pose, because they do often have the power to fire and hire and so on, people stop talking to them as much. Their circle shrinks from the hundreds of people they might have had as a young manager, to the dozens of people they had as a senior leader, to maybe the very few confidants they have at the top. Now, the problem with that becomes the problem, if you will, of sycophants, the people who really want to get ahead because they can flatter you and so on. And I just saw a study a year or so ago, and I can't remember where it was, New York Times or Wall Street Journal or something, stating that no matter how, whether we even know the person is being a complete sycophant, we actually respond positively to that flattery, whether we like it or not. For some
because
reason,
we want it to be true, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So it turns out we tend to promote those people and at the detriment of other people. And any one of these behaviors, either being autocratic, promoting people on the basis of they like you or they say they like you, all of these things can then erode that trust, erode the ability for people to talk to you directly. I'll give you one great example from a friend of mine. He was promoted to a certain level of engineer, I think it was at General Motors, and that was really where you started to have a fairly substantial organization underneath you. And as soon as that happened, one of his old friends came up to him and says, well, now we can't talk to him. And so it's not even that it becomes a specific issue with a leader. Sometimes you have these organizational structures, and the difficulty for a leader is figuring out a way to get down into the organization, spend time with those folks, and continue to get real feedback, as opposed to the stuff that just floats up, which makes you feel good, or which, as Doug was pointing out, you've gotten people to overcommit just so that they get out of the room, so that they can get on with their lives. In graduate school, we used to love it when the boss left town because we could get twice as much done. So you can easily see where the thought process of rise can affect both yourself and those around you in a way that makes it very difficult to manage effectively.
Of course, we're speaking of the CEO disease as it relates to this tenet simply because keeping your commitments may become less and less in the front of people's minds as you rise in leadership. If you don't take an active role in trying to make sure that those commitments that you make are just as important as the ones you expect others to commit to. So Doug, if you would, I'm sorry.
I think that's right, and I think if you add to that a little bit, I think when you get to certain positions, you often have a commitment. You make commitments to people above you, not to people below you. You start making commitments differentially between people and so on. This is unbelievably caustic within the organization. It's very important to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah, it makes sense. So Doug, what has been your experience with this, and what recommendations would you have to keep this from the CEO disease from occurring?
Well, it's actually an interesting point, which I'm always worried about drinking my own Kool-Aid, especially when you're starting something, because you can get yourself to believe, you really sort of build yourself a little bit of a frenzy that what, your strategy, your vision, whatever is the right one. And so I think that what I have found is really helpful is if you drive people to a fact-based, data-driven or quantifiable-driven discussion, no matter what it is. And you get the emotion, the opinion, the inferences, all of that out of the room, and you say, okay, we're going to look at this problem, this issue, whatever it might be, and you set up that culture so that when people come and work with you, that you're not going to shoot the messenger. You just want them to know, look, I want the facts. I want it to be quantifiable. If we don't have them, let's go get them. And then you deal with it, without emotion, without, all the, craziness that people might think would occur when you're working with the CEO. And I think that if you can set up that commitment with your organization that they can bring you the facts, good, bad, or indifferent, and they're quantifiable, and you're going to deal with it in a way that is rational and is going to be, again, something that you've committed to them that you're going to do and not shoot the messenger, then I think you can really get into a very good dialogue. You can get into a very good a situation with your organization where you're not going to suffer that problem where people are going to shine you on or tell you what you want to hear or whatever, because they know that that's not really what you're looking for, that you're looking for a viable way to move the organization forward to whatever it is that you're talking about, what problem you're dealing with, whatever it is. Let's have a fact-based, open dialogue, adults around the table, without all the emotion and drama. And I think that that's what I have found to be very effective with people.
Great. And creating that environment requires you to really be dedicated to that ideal, doesn't it? Yeah. Very good. Well,
what you're going to hear, right? That's the other thing. You can't be afraid of what you're going to hear. Better, different, right? I think you have to be open to people. Not everyone's going to love you. Not everyone's going to like the direction you're going, but if you can get it down to that level of interaction, I think at least people will feel that you're looking at the issues fairly, and then then you go from there.
And in fact, as you climb the ladder, it seems to me like you need to grab a hold of those few people that have no fear
Right.
and are willing to tell you the unvarnished truth, because it gets harder and harder to find those people as you climb.
And you bring them along and you incentivize them to do that. You don't want that kind of, you want that kind of feedback. You're not, maybe you're the smartest person in the room. I've never been the smartest person in the room.
Me neither.
You want to surround yourself with a lot of really smart people, and throwing around the issue, from a lot of different perspectives allows you to have that, robust sort of, very energized and discussion that gets you to, maybe some solutions that you might not have gotten to if you didn't, set up that kind of environment.
Great, wonderful. Any last minute words from you, Terry?
Just to add a couple of things onto that. So I agree wholeheartedly that the fact-based conversation is just a terrific place to start there. There may be one other thing that I would add, and that is I think the opportunity to get out and talk to people, to go see, to ask why, and to show respect from people all across the organization. If you do this on a fairly regular basis, it doesn't have to be every day, it doesn't have to be every hour, but if you make a commitment to doing that, what you'll find is you can get a feel for what's going on, even if people aren't necessarily telling you directly, but you'll create an environment in which people feel that they can. And once in a while, you'll get that nugget. And I think it's a good way to start eroding back some of that CEO disease that you were talking about.
As a final word, I have to tell you a little story about someone I worked with. Tremendous individual. He was somebody I learned a great deal about from management. And this was in a previous company. And he had an interesting practice, which I've actually never tried, that's related to what you're talking about. It was a fairly well-known practice that in this company to do what we called management by walking around. And yet some did it better than others. And this guy was a master at it. He came back from a very long vacation. He had a lot of vacation time stored up. I think he was gone 4 weeks. We got about 100 emails a day, so you can imagine how much email he had to go through. And I saw him on his first day back, and I noticed he was walking around and talking to people. And I said, "Boy, you must have a lot of email to go through." And he said, "Nope." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "I deleted it all." I said, you did what? He said, I deleted it all. And I said, why would you do that? He said, well, here's my reasoning. I've been gone a month. If it's really important, it's been taken care of.
Right.
Or I'll find out about it as I walk around, and then I'll ask them to forward me the emails for backup.
Right.
So that way, he got out of reading thousands of emails that most of us would feel obligated to go through. And he found out, had bootstrapped himself right back up into business within the first day. I was quite impressed. And to tell you the truth, I've never had the guts to try it.
Takes faith in yourself to do that.
It does.
Well,
I wanted to thank you both for joining us. Thank you very much. And it was a really pleasant conversation.
thank you for setting this
Very
up.
well.
This was great. Appreciate it.
Hey, well, Larry, thanks once again for leading a really interesting conversation, and thanks to Doug and Terry for joining us here as well. It's always interesting to see the directions that we take, starting with the idea of commitments, looping through CEO disease and how to avoid it, and then finally coming up with an email approach that few would have the courage to implement directly. Yeah, we're going to be talking about courage a little bit in our next episode coming up. We'll be talking about constructive contention and the fact that red-faced hollering might actually have a valid place in leadership and management. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to talking with you again here on 10 Tenets of Leadership.